My name is Joy, and I've forgotten how to introduce a video because it's been so freaking long. Hello, today we're gonna chat about prose. As a writer, I am constantly noticing the way that things are written, and I love paying attention to the voice and style of a given author because there really is such an art to it, and everyone has a different way of going about it, and it's very subjective. But if you want to be a writer, navigating prose is just an essential skill on a baseline level that you need to have. Whether you decide to take more of a bare minimum, bare bones approach to your storytelling and to your prose, or you want to completely lean into crafting something really eloquent and beautiful. And I'm of the firm believer that there's no real right or wrong way to do it. I think that there are better ways to do it, more effective ways to do it. But yeah, we're going to talk about all things prose. But actually, before we get into it, I did not introduce myself. My name is Joy. I am a fantasy writer. Well, primarily fantasy, but I dabble in a number of things. I make a lot of writing vlogs on this YouTube channel, but sometimes I also like to just sit down and talk about writing craft because I am very much a writing craft nerd and I could talk about it for hours on end. In these writing craft chats, I do want to have the full disclaimer, like I am not a person that stands behind prescriptivist writing advice. Writing is very much an art and everyone kind of has their own way of navigating it. I'm not going to sit here and give you a step-by-step process of how to write your book. I'm more so just sharing some of my observations, some of the things that I've learned as we're having this discussion and just talking about the topic. Take what works for you and leave what doesn't work for you. I mean, I have my own opinions and preferences of what seems to work better, obviously, but like there are books that I don't feel are particularly well written or don't have particularly good prose, and yet they're incredibly popular books that a lot of people love. So what do I know, right? I decided that I wanted to just discuss prose on this channel in a very general sense because I read the first trilogy in the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown in tandem with The Secret History by Donna Tartt. And those two books, I feel, could not have like more different prose in terms of their style. And yet, despite them being completely different, on the one hand, with Pierce Brown's writing style in Red Rising, it's first person present, it's deceptively simple, it's fast-paced, snappy, clear, and very voicey in a lot of ways. A lot of the language in it is very crude, it's kind of humorous, but it also has these very unexpected gems. You scratch your head for a moment and it's like, oh, we were talking about piss like 2 paragraphs ago, but now like this character has just said something really profound. And if you actually investigate it on a line-by-line level, especially, I mean, Red Rising is decent. Golden Sun, the next book in the series, I think is where it really picks up. If you were to observe it on a line-by-line level, it just flows so well. I don't know. I honestly was very surprised by how impressed I was at the prose when I was looking at it more closely. Pierce Brown has a very distinct style that I appreciate. And then you've got The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which is way more heady and meandering. It's more esoteric, so when it does wax philosophical, like you're more expecting it a little bit, but it doesn't make it any less fascinating and interesting. Actually, some of the things that stood out to me the most about The Secret History were the setting, just the words that Donna Tartt uses. They're so delicious, and her ability to paint a vivid picture with her words, and it works so well because from the narrator's lens, I mean, the narrator admits from the beginning that his fatal flaw is, I'm trying to remember exactly how, I think it was something along the lines of putting an immense value on aesthetics and on beautiful things. I'm kind of butchering it. You know what? I have the book right here. I'm just going to pull it up. Yes, the fatal flaw of Richard, the narrator of this book. It's in the first paragraph of chapter 1. It is a morbid longing for the picturesque at all costs. Donna Tartt opens with that and then proceeds to, from Richard's perspective, present such a picturesque atmosphere. And for The Secret History, that's what makes this prose effective. It's in an academic setting, and so naturally, those longer sentences, the more time kind of spent in analyzing every little quirk of the different characters in a scene. And I mean, it's a fairly slow-paced book. It really takes its time to unravel things, but you can just tell in the prose, it it complements the story. Yeah, so I got a little bit carried away there. But the reason that I wanted to talk about prose is that I just find it so fascinating that two books that have such completely different styles can, I think, be equally effective. So, okay, yeah, before I travel down a rabbit hole way too much, if you couldn't already tell, I feel like this video is going to be like a little bit meandering. It's going to be a little bit all over the place. It's not super structured. I'm just here to have a conversation. So I'm sharing my thoughts. I'm going to be answering some questions that you guys sent me surrounding the topic of prose. And then I would actually love it if you shared some of your thoughts down below in the comments. So the first question that I want to talk about is, in your opinion, what constitutes good prose? And I've already sort of alluded to this a little bit. That is a very loaded question. But for me, good prose is obviously so subjective. I mean, different people are going to have different preferences. Like some people prefer prose that's like Brandon Sanderson's, that's very accessible and very understandable. But other people prefer more flowery and purple prose. So for me, the way to assess good prose is to assess, I guess, how effective it is for the story that you're trying to tell. Now, before I dive into that, I do think that there is a baseline. There is a bare minimum. I'm not going to say that all prose has the potential to be good because I don't necessarily think that that's true either. For me, the bare minimum prose to be considered good. Understandability, like it has to be comprehensible, which is correct spelling and grammar for the most part. I mean, there's some flexibility in grammar. Like, I'm fine with a sentence fragment here or there. I frequently open sentences with conjunctions. As long as you're doing it with intention, a lot of those grammar rules can be bent. But knowing how to properly format dialogue, or at least consistently format dialogue. I mean, Sally Rooney doesn't even use quotation marks. I think other things that go into like that baseline skill level is knowing what kinds of sentences to use, varying sentence structure, like have a mix of compound sentences and simple sentences, have some sort of rhythm, have some sort of intentionality, have a strong vocabulary, use fresh language rather than like repeated familiar metaphors. I think those are all good for a baseline. So like that's the bare minimum in my opinion. But then from there, you have to look at your book. So going back to Red Rising, it is a fast-paced, action-packed sci-fi series with characters that are really cunning and intelligent, but also kind of gritty and crude in a lot of ways. So the prose reflects that. But the thing that makes it so good is that you'll have these lines that are deceptively simple, but might have layers of meaning packed behind them. And it's hard to just pick out one line to share because without the greater context, it might not dawn on you how much of a punch this line has. But just one example from Golden Sun. It's literally so simple. The line is, "They're all red in the end." When I read that line, I highlighted it, I got chills. It just worked so well because, as you can imagine, it's in the midst of a very violent scene where, people are bleeding. But what it does is show this great equalizing among people. And in a book series that has so much commentary and theme surrounding class, and that even has, the bottom of the bottom class, they are called capital R Reds. It just, I don't know, something about that line, it just works really well for the context. And yeah, sure, it might be like a slightly cliche idea. I've come across that idea in the past where it's like, oh, everyone bleeds the same color, so like, but its effectiveness is in its simplicity and the way that the idea is portrayed and how vivid it is, because all it is red. That is a punch to the senses. Like, you can see red. It's not even crimson. It's not a flowery language. All it needs is that simple red, and it just works. And going back to The Secret History, the thing that I like about The Secret History is that it is very eloquent. The sentences are very long and the vocabulary is strong, but it's also not overwrought. I don't feel like the diction is complicated for the sake of being complicated at any point, which is a really tricky line to walk on, especially in a book with an academic setting. Okay, I just found an excellent example of setting in The Secret History, which if you recall, that's one of the things I love the most about the prose in this book. The important thing in my mind is that it's not just setting for setting's sake. The setting tells us more about the characters, because what Tart is describing here is the home of two important characters in the book. We're kind of still getting to know these characters, so the details that she chooses to share not only paints a picture for the reader of the setting, which is, what setting typically is, but it also illuminates the characters, right? That we're getting to know, like this is their home, and all of these details give us more information, and it works so effectively. So I'm going to read it. And yes, it's several very long sentences strung together, but the details, they're lists, right? And the details are just, I'm obsessed. Though not untidy exactly, it verged on being so. Books were stacked on every available surface. The tables were cluttered with papers, ashtrays, bottles of whiskey, boxes of chocolates. Umbrellas and galoshes made passage difficult in the narrow hall. In Charles's room, clothes were scattered on the rug, and a rich confusion of ties hung from the door of the wardrobe. Camilla's night table was littered with empty teacups, leaky pens, dead marigolds, and a water glass, and on the foot of her bed was laid a half-played game of solitaire. The layout of the place was peculiar, with unexpected windows and halls that led nowhere, and low doors I had to duck to get through, and everywhere I looked was some fresh oddity. You can just tell, you can just see how it's just so good. And obviously, like, you don't want to necessarily describe every single setting to this extent, but it's pulling a lot of weight. I definitely got really carried away there. Again, my apologies. I know this video is going to be so all over the place, but hopefully it's still interesting to listen to. This is what it's like to talk to me, okay? I think that I started off talking about effective prose being like what works for the story that you're trying to tell. I stand by that. Kind of circling back around to that idea, I guess another potential example could be, if you are writing a historical romance, I think that effective prose could look like emulating, Jane Austen, adopting some of the language from that era. I don't think that you have to do that. I think that you could subvert it, but that's what effective prose in that circumstance might look like. It's finding the right voice and style for the story that you're trying to tell and being consistent with it. It's impossible for me to, I guess, come up with perfect examples for like every circumstance. Like, it's just something that you have to figure out. But the main point in my eyes is making sure you identify what you're going for and pursuing it, being consistent with it, if that makes sense. Because I really do think that any sort of voice can be great. It's really all just in the execution and whether or not it works with your story. I know that that's all very vague. Another thing that I just literally thought of because I came across it in The Secret History while I was looking for a different line. It is actually, I think it's an underrated skill when it comes to prose. It's your ability to have like a cohesive flow of ideas and how you transition between scenes, between ideas, between, even like a chronological transition. That can actually be a really tricky thing to do well because it's something that you don't even want the reader to notice necessarily, but you're leading the reader along with those transitional pieces. So that's another thing that Donna Tartt actually does really well. I've noticed that she tends to open up her scenes and her chapters with kind of a topic sentence. Throw back to elementary school where you were writing your first essays and they were telling you about topic sentences. Donna Tartt literally does this. One example is starting a scene with the chronological sorting of memories is an interesting business. And then going on to summarize several months from Richard's perspective, but it was done in an impressionistic way, telling kind of flashes of emotions and moments, but it's really asynchronous, and it all goes back to that initial topic sentence where, as a reader, you are prepared and equipped for what was about to happen because of that first idea that was introduced. And that's a little detail that is so easy to overlook and just like not even notice, but it just that's part of what can make prose really good, is your ability to communicate those ideas and prepare the reader for what they're about to read without them even realizing it. Oh my gosh, when it comes to good prose, I'm still thinking about that question. There are literally so many things that I could say. I think for me personally, so this is kind of not getting into like personal preference territory. I will say I know some people that prefer prose that is comfortable, that is filled with familiar language just because they know what to picture, they know what to expect, and it's just easier to digest that way. And like, that's fine. That's fine. But for me personally, I prefer prose that isn't too, I guess the term is familiar. I prefer when the metaphors and descriptive language are not overused, and when the diction is what I like to call yummy. For me, yummy diction is using words that are not necessarily like esoteric, and you don't want the reader to feel like you opened up a thesaurus and picked the most obscure word you can possibly find. But I also really appreciate it when I just appreciate when it's rich and intentional, and I can tell that the writer didn't write something and then leave it. They didn't just write the first metaphor that came to mind. They revisited it and came up with a more specific metaphor, if that makes sense. I feel like, okay, I'm gonna need to just share some examples. Okay, I'm just gonna say off the top of my head, if your writing has these things, I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying that I tend to personally prefer books with like fresher language. And I will also say that in my first drafts and even subsequent drafts, like I have some of this language as well. I think there's a difference between the writing is full of this language, like to an excessive degree, versus like sometimes they have this language, but then they also have like a nice balance of fresher language mixed in there, which I think that tends to be closer to what my writing is like. Because the last thing I want for you is to like hear this and then completely overthink, especially your first draft. I've found that my first drafts are riddled with familiar language. It's in the line editing stage and the revision stage where I sit down and actually like really think about it. So, okay, just a couple of examples of familiar phrases that I just thought of. I've seen like piercing or icy blue eyes a lot. Like that's a fairly common thing. And I've definitely used this in my own writing, so don't feel bad if you use it. But I think that, there are perhaps other ways to say it that would be a little bit fresher. Another one is a chill ran down her spine. Again, that's a very common phrase. There's nothing inherently wrong with it, and I think that it can work. But if you read it, you're not going to sit there and think, oh, that was a really good line either. Another one is she smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Like, that's an idea that I've seen again and again, and so on. I mean, I'm sure that you can come up with multiple of these like familiar phrases, ways to communicate ideas that have been used a lot. Compare that, right? Okay, so those are like some familiar things. I am going to pull a line from The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex E. Harrow. Alex Harrow is a queen when it comes to rich prose and vivid language that doesn't feel too familiar. But it's not like esoteric either. Like it's very understandable and you're like, wow, like that is such a great image and so easy to understand. I'm just gonna read it. Ready? I shivered beside the fish-paled nakedness of 24 other women, all of us made ugly and unsecret like snails pulled from their shells. Like, are you kidding me? That's the kind of line that makes me just groan with why didn't I think of that? It's so easy to understand, but so vivid and loaded too, because it communicates this visual of vulnerability and shame and nakedness and ugliness, and it's just so good. Hi, it's the next day because I was having technical difficulties and I ran out of time to film. So yeah. Let's continue on. I wanted to share, I am currently drinking my morning coffee out of Anna New's merch. Is it not like the cutest little tumbler ever? Oh my gosh, I love it so much. I'll leave a little link to her store in the description box in case you're interested. But okay, moving along. I have to like regather my thoughts. I do feel like I could talk about this for such a long time, but I should probably rein it in a little bit so I'm not going way overboard. Although I will say, okay, the last thing I want to talk about in regards to like good prose is a word economy. I'm not going to dwell on it a ton because I have seen a lot of people talk about word economy, but the basic idea of word economy is how efficient are you in your language and in your descriptions and in how you package information, if that makes any sense at all. I do think that there is a place for long and meandering prose. I mean, The Lord of the Rings comes to mind. However, I think especially nowadays, readers tend to get a little bit impatient if you meander too much. And there is a certain level of skill to ensuring that every single word pulls weight. Word economy is your ability to say a lot with a little. I just read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab a couple of weeks ago, and I distinctly remember thinking that she had really good word economy, or at least she had many lines that had like dual or triple functions. It's really nice when a line can move the narrative forward, but also function as exposition in that it shares something about the character or about the world or about the magic system or something like that. But if you are not familiar with The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, it's essentially about a woman that made a deal with the devil to be immortal, but the catch that she was unaware of is that she would be unable to make any sort of mark or impression, which includes other people's memory. So the second they leave the room or she leaves the room, they don't remember her anymore, and it's as if she never existed. And the other element is that she has remained unchanged. She doesn't age, she doesn't gain or lose weight no matter what, whether or not she eats. Like she can't die, she can't change, anything like that. I don't think that she can even like cut her hair. But there was one line very early on in the book where she walked into a store and was going to get new clothes, and it just simply said she knows her sizes, they haven't changed. And that was part of how V.E. Schwab established the unchanging nature of Addie LaRue. And it's so satisfying and efficient because it's not like V.E. Schwab spent like a whole paragraph explaining how it works. And it also wasn't off topic either. Like it just was in perfect conjunction with what was happening in the story at the time. And that information was given to us in stride. And yes, of course, there is a place for like vivid and specific language. I love it when we get into the nitty gritty, but there are other times where summary is valuable. I actually think that a mark of a good writer is knowing like when to summarize and when to get really specific. But another example from The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. There is nothing wrong with Roger, but there is nothing right either. It's so simple, but it works. And it's multi-layered. So yeah, that's all I'm gonna say about word economy specifically, but I mean, there's so much that you could say about it. But yeah, those were just a few things that came to mind for me. But wow, yeah, all of what I was just talking about for most of this video thus far has been just discussing some of the marks of good prose or what might constitute good or effective prose, at least in my opinion. I did not get into everything. I just mentioned some of the things that stood out to me. So please do share if there's something that you can think of that you really appreciate in good prose. And also I want to know, like, what is good prose to you? Talk to me about it. This is a discussion. The rest of the questions that people asked are a little bit more specific to me and my writing and my prose. So I will answer them gladly, but also if you have answers to these questions about your own writing, I also want to hear from you, just to be clear. But I do think that it's a really fun topic to talk about, hence why I'm talking about this for a really long time. Okay, the first question is, do you use inspiration from other books to model your prose on? And do you check previous annotations? So I've heard a lot of people discuss this in the AuthorTube space, like especially Lindy Jung and Cam Fajardo have talked about this a lot. And absolutely, I do. I don't know that I would use the word model because that feels a little bit more like copying, but inspiration certainly, and I do generally try to be aware of, okay, what are some books that emulate the same kind of prose that I want to emulate, and then if I get stuck in my writing or in my line level editing and I need some inspiration or I need to see an example of how it's done well, I will revisit those books. But people also talk about this in terms of vocal training, where before you even sit down to write while you're drafting, it can be really helpful to, say, read a chapter in a book that has a similar voice to what you're going for. But yeah, vocal training can just put your brain in the right creative space, which I've found so helpful because prose has a rhythm and a tone to it that sometimes you can know what you're going for, but unless it's in your head, like you've recently read it, it just won't come out, it like gets stuck on the way out. As for checking previous annotations, if you don't know, if I read a book physically, like if I have a physical copy of the book, I tend to annotate it aggressively. I love annotating. It does take me significantly longer to finish the book then, so I'm actually pretty picky about what books I choose to read physically and annotate. I have two examples right here, Pierre Nessie and I Who Have Never Known Men. When I annotate, I have tabs, and I don't think you can really see it because the sunlight is making it super overexposed, but I have lots of post-it notes, I have lots of highlights, I take notes directly in the book, all that stuff. Frankly, it has been so helpful to me if I remember, say, for example, just kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier, transitions in prose. Like, how do you transition from idea to idea? How do you begin a scene? If for whatever reason I'm just feeling oddly stuck, or I feel like I've used the same method over and over again and I don't want to use that method again. This is sort of a silly example, but I have noticed in the past when I was like a younger writer, I would begin most of the scenes with my characters waking up. Like, that's what I did when I was a teenage writer. At one point I realized that and I was like, man, I should really try to figure out a new way to write a scene or like begin a scene. And referring back to what other writers do can just give you some ideas. So in that case, I would flip through, and obviously it's easier to find the lines and pieces of prose that I admired or thought were really good previously because like they're already highlighted. I already have the note, I already have the tab, and I have a tab key here too. And I usually talk about like good writing or prose that I like, that sort of thing. So if I'm wanting inspiration and I feel like I'm just dry of ideas, yeah, I'll flip through some of my old annotated books and see my old notes, and it does help. I don't do it all that often. It's not like I do it every single day, but it's a helpful little tool to have in my arsenal for sure. Another question is, how much does your prose change throughout the first draft, and how conscious is that change? Oh, it definitely changes a lot, and sometimes it's conscious and sometimes it's not. The way that I write is definitely influenced in part by what I'm reading at the time, so you can kind of see the fluctuations, cat's tails like poking in the frame. I mean, it's not completely different, it's subtle. When I go back and read it, I can kind of tell, oh, I was definitely reading a really action-packed book because a lot of my sentences are a little bit shorter or snappier. Or I was reading a book with a lot of witty dialogue because I have a little bit more banter than normal. So I would say a lot of it is subconscious, just based on what I'm reading and based on how I'm feeling too, and like what my mood is, if I'm feeling more poetic, if I'm feeling more this or that. But you know, the first draft, that's where I just kind of let it happen. I don't try to fuss about it. I'm just trying to get the words out and trying to get the story down. If I get a nice line in the first draft, great, but I really am not trying super hard to make the prose wonderful because that's going to come later. And as I'm writing the second draft right now, I am tightening up the prose quite a bit. I'm not quite at like the line level tinkering yet, but since I am doing a full rewrite of the book anyways, I am using this opportunity to reorganize my ideas and generally try to make sure I have a good balance of, say, narrative and dialogue and description and that sort of thing. In short, my first draft is a mess when it comes to prose, but I just don't worry about it. How do you think your prose has improved since you first began writing, and what helped? This is a really good question. Considering the fact that I first started writing when I was like 10 years old or like an actual child, it has improved tremendously. I've actually always been pretty good at grammar in general. Like, I always sort of intuitively knew how to format dialogue, for example, just because I had read so much. But my general mastery of the language has improved. I'm just a lot more confident in terms of even just how I structure sentences and how to communicate tone and what kinds of words to pick for certain circumstances. I have a greater intuitive grasp of prose in general. Then when I was in college, I actually majored in creative writing, and that's the point when I think got a firmer grasp on how to write a little bit more poetically. I was writing a lot of poetry during my creative writing major, but I was also writing a lot of short stories. And that's just when I learned how to come up with less familiar phrases, I guess. And my writing professors would really have us pay attention to the world around us, first and foremost. They said the best writers are usually the best observers. So I would just pay really close attention to nature, to people. I would write down little ideas that I had for metaphors and kind of collect them and try to intentionally make connections throughout my day so that when I sat down to write, I then kind of had already a lot of ideas, phrases, and things that I can play with. Like I had a collection of words and comparisons and all of that, like ready to go. So that was another area in which I improved during college in particular, was just coming up with more creative ways to say things, but not so creative that it took away from the story. Kind of trying to find that balance. And then nowadays, I mean, in the last year and a half, I feel like I've managed a groundedness in my prose that I'd never had before. Like sometimes I would definitely get like a little bit melodramatic in my writing, or it wouldn't really be balanced between like the action of the scene versus the internality and all of that. But just from writing a lot, I've just figured out how to not be too heavy-handed. Part of that is just from reading a ton as well, because in the last couple of years I've been reading so much, and reading not YA. I read so much middle grade and YA, obviously, like when I was in high school and stuff, which can be a little bit melodramatic, not gonna lie. That's just kind of how those books are, which is fine because that's what I was reading, that's what I was emulating. And then while I was in college, I read a lot of classics, which was good for me, but it also wasn't that practical because I wasn't trying to write prose like the way that classics are written most of the time. So in the last few years, I've actually been reading a lot more adult fiction. And since that's actually what I'm trying to write, it's very helpful for me. I've been able to shift into more of a mature adult voice versus a YA voice. And I do want to say, like, there's nothing wrong with a YA voice if you're trying to write YA. And it took reading a lot of books and being pretty intentional to not be too heavy-handed and to allow there to be space to breathe, allow there to be some subtext that the reader can catch on to. And then the last couple of questions are kind of similar to each other. So the first of the last two is, what do you consider a hallmark of your own prose and what makes your writing you? And kind of along similar lines is, what 3 words would you use to describe your prose style? My goodness, if I'm being honest, this is really challenging for me to assess objectively because I'm like, I don't know. When I look at my prose, I tend to see most of the things that are wrong with it. Let me just try to, like, I guess, consider some of the hallmarks of my prose style first, and then that might help me to lead into, I guess, like how I would describe it using 3 words. When I think of books that I've read recently, I think that my prose maybe most closely resembles like Robin Hobb, like either like Robin Hobb or perhaps Rebecca Ross. Like I'm somewhere in the middle between those 2 writers. I think for Robin Hobb, there's so much depth in the interiority of her characters. She does a really good job of getting you in their head and getting them thinking, but it also doesn't get too out of hand. It feels so raw and visceral. And I also think that the metaphors that she chooses and like her personification of nature is also very effective. I actually have a quote from one of her books that I wrote down because I started making a list of like scrumptious prose, and I stopped updating it after a while because I think I just forgot about it. However, I had a couple of lines from Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb written down here. Here's the first one. The world came back. I knew myself a mangled, pitiful thing, a puppet with half its strings tangled, or a horse with a severed tendon. There's so many layers to why that's good, but I'm gonna move on. The next line, it's just so visceral. I love it. They called out to me with voices full of blood. The thick fog gulped their cries greedily. It made the death of a sailor no more than the keening of a seabird. Mwah. Chef's kiss. So those are just like a few lines. I was like, I just love how rich and textured it is. And that's kind of what I'm trying to go for. My prose is not very casual, but it's not extremely formal either. It's somewhere in between, like maybe slightly formal. It is a high fantasy, at least in Project Phoenix. And I think that most of the time I'm going to be writing kind of high fantasy books. So it's going to kind of have that slightly elevated prose that I think is typical of most high fantasy. I do think that my prose might lean slightly more literary, but not to a crazy extent or anything. I just think it's maybe more literary than something like ACOTAR or I don't know, like some of like the popular romantasy books out there. Nothing against them, but they just have a much more commercial tone to the writing, which in my opinion, commercial tone usually means very accessible and also is filled with repetitive or familiar phrases. So like I'm also like lumping Brandon Sanderson into that. And again, great stories, but it's just not like literary leaning. I do think I try to be a little bit more, I don't know, something else. Whether or not I actually achieve that goal remains to be seen. I'm so sorry. I still don't really know how to answer the question of like, how would you describe your prose in 3 words? It's just not coming to me. The word that keeps coming into my mind is atmospheric, but I don't even know if that's true. I do think that I am like very emotionally and physically grounded. I'm very in tune with my characters' emotions and how it makes them feel physically. And I also have a lot of sensory details that are very specific. But then again, like that's just typical prose. So I don't know that that necessarily makes my prose particularly unique. So I don't know. That's a great question. I sort of didn't answer that all the way because I don't know how to look at my own prose objectively. I know what I'm going for. I don't know. I feel like I need someone else to read it for me so that they can then tell me what it's like, because viewing your own stuff, like your own writing objectively like that and assessing it is, at least for me, it's like near impossible unless I were to like put this project away for like a whole year and then revisit it later. So yeah, I'm sorry, that was not very satisfying, but I did my best, okay? I kind of limped through that answer. Anyways, I think that that's all the time that I have today to talk about prose. I've been talking about this for a very long time and I've loved every second of it, but I also know that I have barely scratched the surface. Like I don't know, I've been all over the place with this video, but it's also been fun. So I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, that's wonderful, because I do hope to make more of these kind of podcast style writing craft discussion videos more often. I really love talking about writing craft. Sometimes I shy away from it because I don't want people to feel like I'm telling them how to write or what to do. But I personally love watching videos like this just to glean more ideas and get other people's perspectives on craft. So if there are any specific topics you would like me to discuss in future writing craft chat videos, please do let me know. So yeah, I hope that you have a wonderful writing day and I will see you next time. Bye!